There are stories a town carries for years without meaning to. Stories that start as jokes and end as something closer to lessons. This is one of those. I was younger then, and I will admit I was among the ones who laughed. Most of us were. You have to understand that before anything else. We were not cruel people. We were just the kind of people who thought we already knew the difference between a smart decision and a foolish one. Turns out the county auction on that cool October morning was about to show us just how thin that difference really is. The auction house smelled the way it always did. Diesel exhaust and sawdust and the faint sweetness of old hay. Voices bounced off the corrugated metal walls. Men in seed caps drank coffee from paper cups. The auctioneers were moving fast through the lots, the way they always did when they wanted to be done before noon, and the early lots were going clean and quick. I remember noticing him standing near the back of the crowd. He was not the kind of man who drew attention to himself easily, which is probably why so few people thought to wonder what he was doing there. He wore a faded olive drab cap, the brim curved soft from years of use. His jacket was denim, worn pale at the elbows. His hands, when he pulled his coffee cup from the folding table by the door, were careful and unhurried, the hands of a man who had learned not to waste a single motion. He had served, years before any of this. You could not always tell exactly when or where, because he never said much about it. What you could tell was that it had made him patient in a way most men his age were not. Patient and quiet and very, very deliberate. He was a widower by then, had been for a while. He lived out on the county road in a farmhouse that sat behind an old red barn with paint peeling off the south-facing wall in long strips. His land was not large. His equipment was not new. He had no hired hand, no dog, no working alarm on the property. Just the land and the barn and a diesel tank behind it, and a tool shed with one old tractor parked inside. He was what you might call a man living on the edge of enough, though he never complained about it loud enough for anyone to hear. He had something folded in the breast pocket of that denim jacket. A check. His last pension payment. I did not know that at the time. None of us did, but I know it now. Every dollar he had coming to him, folded twice and tucked against his chest like a letter he had already decided to mail. The auctioneer's voice shifted. A gate opened somewhere in the back pens, and then the noise came. Not a sound so much as a force. A wall of screaming, flapping, honking chaos that hit the corrugated walls and bounced right back at everyone in that building. 90 geese had just entered the lot. The laughter started before the dust had even settled. I remember it clearly. That particular quality of laughter you only hear in a room full of men, who are all relieved they had the good sense not to do something. It rolled around the auction barn like a warm wind, loose and easy, the kind that does not mean harm exactly, but does not try too hard to hide its pleasure either. The geese were making an unholy sound. There is no other word for it. 90 birds in a confined space will produce something that sits between a freight train and a church organ played by someone who has never seen a church organ. And every person in that building had their shoulders up around their ears. The auctioneer, a round-faced man with a red collar and a voice worn smooth from years of county work, he started his call with a grin already pulling at one side of his mouth. He listed the lot. 90 birds, assorted. He named a number. He looked out at the crowd. Nobody moved. He dropped the number. He tried again. in that practiced drawl that makes lowering a price sound like a generous gift. Still nothing. A couple of men near the back actually turned away, which is its own kind of answer. The grin on the auctioneer's face spread a little further, the way a man's grin does when a thing he suspected has been confirmed. And then the old veteran raised his hand, just once, quiet and level, the way you raise your hand when you have already made up your mind, and the raising is only a formality. The auctioneer paused, just a half beat, enough for the room to notice. And then he brought his gavel down so fast it was almost polite, like he did not want to draw more attention to what had just happened. But the room had already seen it, and the laughter that followed was the full kind, the kind with voices in it. Someone near me said something I will not repeat. Someone else said the old man had finally gone over the edge. A feed store regular 2 rows up was laughing so hard he had to take off his cap and hold it against his knee. Even the auctioneer allowed himself a quiet shake of the head as he moved on to the next lot. The old veteran did not look at any of them. He stood up, settled that olive drab cap, and walked toward the pens. Loading 90 geese into slatted wooden crates is not a gentle process, and it took time, and there were men who lingered just to watch. He worked without hurry, without visible frustration, his careful hands moving the way they did around everything, like he had made a promise to the thing he was handling and intended to keep it. When the last crate was secured in the bed of his old pickup, he drove out through the gravel lot and turned north on the county road. I watched those taillights disappear into the tree line. The geese were screaming the entire way home, loud enough that men stepping out of the diner 2 miles up the road would later say they heard something strange passing on the road that afternoon, though they could not say what. Now, what most people saw that first week was spectacle. They drove by slow on the county road, slowing down the way people do when they pass a house fire. Not to help, just to look. A few stopped their trucks on the gravel shoulder and watched over the fence. 90 geese in a barnyard that had been quiet for years is a difficult thing to describe to someone who has never witnessed it. The noise alone was enough to carry across 2 fields. The birds moved in shifting, unpredictable masses, bumping against the barn doors, testing the fence line, stretching their necks toward anything that moved. More than one man told the story at the feed store that week, and each telling made the old veteran sound a little more foolish than the last. But I want to tell you what was actually happening on that side of the fence. He was up before light every morning. That part never changed. It was the same discipline he had carried out of whatever life he had before the farm. The kind of routine that doesn't require a reason because it has become the reason itself. He would come out of the farmhouse in the gray pre-dawn, lantern in one hand and a tin pail of cracked corn in the other, and he would walk the barnyard the same way every time. Not hurried, not stumbling around in the dark. Measured, patient, like a man reading a map he had already memorized. The geese learned that pail quickly. By the 3rd morning, the leaders, and there were leaders, 3 or 4 birds that moved ahead of the others, that turned first, that positioned themselves at the corners of whatever space they occupied. Those birds began to follow him. Not docilely. Geese are not docile creatures and never will be. But they began to track him, to orient on him, to treat that pre-dawn figure with the lantern as a landmark in their world. He noticed which birds those were, watched them, began scattering the first handful of corn toward them specifically, not as a reward exactly, but as an acknowledgement. He understood something about leading that most people had forgotten or never known, that you do not command the whole, you earn the ones at the front, and the rest will follow from there. By the end of that first week, the barnyard had changed. It still sounded chaotic to the men slowing down on the county road. But if you had stood at the fence in the early morning and watched closely, you would have seen something different. You would have seen a pattern. The flock spread and thinned along the barn's east wall during the flat morning light, then gathered tighter near the fuel tank behind the barn as the day warmed. They moved like water finding the low places in a field, not random but responsive, sensitive. He had not trained them exactly. He had simply paid attention to what they already were, and what they already were was watchful, territorial, loud enough to wake the dead. He knew that. He had known it before he ever raised his hand at the auction. And that is when the valley decided it had seen enough to have an opinion. It started, the way these things always do, at the feed store. A man came in one Tuesday morning and mentioned the geese, said he had slowed his truck on the county road and counted what he could, and the old veteran had somewhere near 100 of the things honking around his barnyard, like the whole farm had lost its mind. By Thursday, the story had grown legs. By the following week, it had become a kind of ongoing entertainment, the sort of small-town comedy that fills the space between serious troubles. The feed store clerk, a young man, maybe 25, with a quick mouth and an audience he enjoyed, had developed a full impression of the geese that he performed behind the counter. He would throw his arms out wide, puff his chest, and let out a sound that was half honk, half shriek, and the men leaning on the counter would laugh until they had to set their coffee cups down. Someone started calling the farm the goose capital of the county. The name stuck for a while. The younger farmer to the east was less theatrical about it, but his mockery cut more directly because he shared a fence line and considered himself a practical man. He mentioned it to 3 separate people in the span of 1 week, at the diner, at a church parking lot conversation, and once over the phone, from what someone later recalled. He had the calm, knowing tone of a man watching a slow-motion mistake and choosing to document it rather than prevent it. He said the old veteran had finally gone soft in the head, said grief does that to men who live alone too long, said he felt sorry for him, which is what people say when they don't actually feel sorry but want to sound like they do. Then someone, nobody ever admitted to it, tacked a handwritten note to the wooden fence post at the end of the veteran's driveway. It was written on the back of a torn feed receipt. It said, "Honk if you wasted your pension." There was a small drawing of a bird beside it, lopsided with exaggerated wings. The old man found it on a Tuesday morning. He read it once, standing at the fence post with one hand resting on the wood. Then he folded it, put it in his breast pocket, picked up the fence tool he had set on the ground, and went back to work on the gap in the barnyard fence. A post had heaved during a rain, softening the ground, and the wire had gone slack on one side. He worked the wire carefully, methodically, with the unhurried hands of a man who had fixed broken things for 60 years and expected to fix more. The geese moved around him while he worked, flowing past his boots, resuming their slow patrol of the barnyard as if nothing had interrupted them. He said nothing about the note. Not that day, not later. Some people took his silence for embarrassment. They were reading him wrong, but they would not know that for a while yet. The geese settled early that evening. That was one of the things he had come to notice about them. They had their own internal clock, some collective sense of when the light had gone thin enough and the air had cooled enough that patrolling was finished for the day. They gathered near the barn door in a loose, rustling mass, tucking their heads and murmuring to themselves, and the barnyard went quieter than it had any right to be. He washed his hands at the outdoor spigot, dried them on a rag he kept looped through his belt, and went inside. The farmhouse was small, and he had never tried to make it more than that. A wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, though one of them had not been pulled out in years, a landline phone on the wall with a curling cord, a window above the kitchen sink that looked out toward the barn, and on the sill of that window, a photograph in a plain frame. His wife, standing in a field he recognized even now, squinting a little into the sun, half smiling the way she always did when she thought someone was making too much of her. He stood at that window for a long time. Outside, the barnyard was going gray and still. He could see the faint shapes of the geese near the barn door, and beyond them, half hidden in the dusk, the bulk of the diesel fuel tank sitting behind the barn on its iron cradle. 40 gallons left in it, roughly. Enough to run the tractor through the rest of the season if nothing went wrong. The tools in the shed, the good wrenches, the bar clamps, the spare hydraulic line, had taken him 20 years to accumulate one piece at a time. He looked at the photograph. No dog, he said quietly. No alarm. Nobody coming to help if I call. His voice was low, the way it got when he was talking to himself, or to her, which were not always different things. That tank goes, I can't plant in the spring. Tools go, I'm done with half the work I need to do before freeze. He paused, watching the last light fade off the metal of the tank. I've had nothing between me and a bad outcome before. You trust what you've got. He had trusted sentinels before, men posted at the edges of things, watching, waiting, with no weapon more reliable than their own alertness. He knew what it meant to have something alive and awake standing between you and what was coming in the dark. He knew the difference between noise that meant nothing and noise that meant everything. The geese were not chaos. They had never been chaos to him. He tapped the window frame once with 2 fingers, the way a man confirms something to himself, and turned away from the glass. He ate a plain supper, washed the single dish, and sat for a while with the radio low, a weather report crackling through on the AM band. Rain coming by Thursday. He would need to check the barn roof again before then. Outside, the geese held their ground in the dark. The rain did not come until Friday that week, a day late, the way weather in that valley often was. But something else arrived on schedule, something nobody had thought to watch for. It started small, the kind of thing you notice only if you are paying the right kind of attention, which most of the neighbors were not. By the 3rd week of October, the geese had settled into a pattern. Not a pattern anyone had taught them. Not a routine drawn up on paper or coaxed out of them with rope and grain and patience. They simply began to do what geese, in their oldest instincts, have always done. At dusk, when the light went copper and low across the fields, a portion of the flock, always roughly the same birds, the heavier ones, the ones with the widest wingspans, drifted toward the barn entrance and arranged themselves loosely across it. Not a wall, not a line, just a presence. Alert, facing outward, heads moving in that slow mechanical way geese have, as if they are tracking something the human eye cannot resolve. Another group, smaller, 6 or 8 birds, took up position near the diesel fuel tank behind the barn. They did not roost there. They did not sleep. They stood in the mud and the cooling air, and they watched the fence line. He saw this from the kitchen window the first time it happened. He did not go out to adjust it. He did not redirect the birds or reward the ones in the barn doorway while ignoring the ones at the tank. He waited a full evening before he changed anything at all. What he changed was the timing of the evening feed. He had been setting the cracked corn out in the barnyard center near the water trough, the same way he had since the first week. He moved it. Not far, just enough. He placed a smaller portion near the barn entrance just before dusk, and another near the tank, each night at the same hour. He did not scatter it. He set it down in a specific spot and walked away. That was all. Looking back now from whatever quiet distance the years have given, it is easy to see what he understood that the rest of us did not. He was not teaching the geese to stand guard. He was acknowledging that they already knew where to stand. He was simply telling them, in the only language that passed cleanly between a man and a bird, that he had noticed. That their instinct had been seen, and that he respected it enough to meet it with something real. The feed timing was not a trick. It was a conversation. By the end of that week, the positioning was consistent every evening. Barn entrance, fuel tank, fence line, covered without a command. The old man would come out at dusk, set the pails down, and stand for a moment in the cooling air, watching the flock settle into its arrangement. He had posted sentinels before. He knew the feeling of a perimeter that held. He said nothing about it to anyone. He just kept the feed coming, and the flock kept showing up where it mattered. The radio sat on the kitchen windowsill, beside the photograph, and it was on every morning the way some men kept a Bible open, not always listened to, but always present. He had carried the habit from a life that taught him. Information came in fragments, and fragments had to be gathered before they made sense. Weather reports, commodity prices, county notices. He absorbed it all in the same quiet way he absorbed the sound of the wind shifting direction, or the particular silence that fell over the barnyard just before rain. It was a Tuesday morning in early October when the report came through, measured and flat the way the local AM anchor delivered everything, as if the weight of a thing had nothing to do with the words used to carry it. A farm 4 miles east on the county road. Diesel fuel drawn from an outdoor tank overnight. Hand tools taken from an unlocked shed. The neighbor, a man who had expanded his operation that year, and apparently not expanded his caution to match, had come out at dawn to find the tank siphoned low and the shed stripped of what it held. No one had heard anything. No one had seen anything. The matter had been reported to the county sheriff's office. The old man listened. He did not turn the radio up. He did not set down his coffee mug with any particular force. He finished his breakfast, rinsed the mug in the basin, and went out to the morning like any other morning. He said nothing about it to anyone, but that night, he walked the barnyard an extra time. It was not a dramatic thing. There was no lantern swung in the darkness, no long examination of shadows. He simply walked the perimeter the way a man walks a line he has already memorized, checking not with his eyes, but with something older than eyes. A sense built up from years of understanding that the gap between safe and not safe was usually small, and usually where you stopped paying attention. He tried the padlock on the tool shed with 2 fingers. It held. He looked at the diesel tank behind the barn, the dull metal catching what little moonlight reached it, and he stood there for a moment, with his hands in his jacket pockets. The geese were already distributed the way they had learned to distribute themselves. The larger birds near the barn entrance, a loose cluster along the fence line, 2 or 3 settled within a few feet of the tank itself. They were calm now, making that low, continuous murmur that he had come to understand as the sound of alertness at rest. Not sleeping, resting. There was a difference, and they held it instinctively, the way good sentinels always had. He did not move them. He did not call to them. He let them settle where they had chosen. He stood in the cool October air for another minute, long enough to hear the flock breathe, long enough to feel the padlock's cold metal still against his palm. Then he turned and walked back toward the farmhouse and left them to the dark. The morning of it was ordinary. That was what people kept saying afterward, that there had been nothing in the air to warn you, no feeling of weather turning, no particular sign. Just a bright October Tuesday, the kind that came along once or twice a year, where the light was so clean and direct it seemed to press everything into sharper outline. The hills to the west stood up clear against a sky that was nearly white. The fields had that exhausted, grateful quality they get after harvest, like a man sitting down after a long day. Nothing about it said trouble. He had been inside the barn most of the morning, working a loose board on one of the stall dividers with a hammer and a handful of old nails he had sorted and straightened the evening before. The geese were in the barnyard. He could hear them. That familiar, ongoing murmur, punctuated by the occasional irritated honk when one cut too close to another's patch of ground. He did not look out to check them. He did not need to. What he did not see, because no one on that side of the farm could see it, was the 3 men who came through the back pasture sometime around early afternoon. They had studied the place. That became clear later. They knew about the fuel tank. They knew the farmhouse sat far enough from the barn that a man inside it would not hear much. They had brought empty grain sacks folded under their arms, and they moved the way men move when they believe no one is watching. Not running, not creeping, just walking with the ease of people who have already decided the outcome. They cut through the back fence wire. It took less than a minute. They were perhaps 40 feet from the tank, maybe less, when the geese found them. There was no single bird that sounded the alarm. It did not work that way. The cluster near the barn entrance turned as one body. Necks extended, and then the sound began. Not a single honk, not even a chorus of honks. Something larger than that, a wall of it, a rolling, continuous eruption of noise that had no clean beginning and no ceiling. 90 birds in full alarm all at once, wings hammering the air, feet churning the mud, the whole flock surging toward the far fence line in a broken, furious wave. The sound went up and out across the valley like something thrown. It moved over the dry fields, over the fence line, over the old creek bed, and it reached the adjoining property where, as it happened, 4 men had gathered that same afternoon to argue about a boundary marker that had shifted after the spring flooding. All 4 of them stopped talking at exactly the same moment. They turned their heads toward the sound. One of them, the man who had argued loudest all afternoon about where the boundary post had stood before the spring floods shifted the creek bank, later said that the sound made the hair on his arms stand up before his brain had even decided what it was. It was that kind of noise. Not an animal sound exactly. More like a weather event. More like a pressure system rolling in from somewhere low and serious. The four of them stood at the fence line and watched. What they saw first was the geese. 90 birds in full motion along the back field. A broken white wave against the brown autumn stubble. Wings up, necks out, the sound pouring off them in sheets. And then, ahead of that wave, they saw the men. 3 of them, running in a way that had nothing dignified about it. Sacks swinging loose and empty at their sides, boots catching the soft mud and pulling free again with every lurching step. One of them lost a boot entirely for a moment, hopped, jammed it back on, kept going. They were not looking back. They did not stop to look back. They cut wide around the corner post, scrambled through the gap in the fence they'd made themselves not 5 minutes earlier, and disappeared across the open ground beyond. The geese did not follow past the property line. They stopped there, still screaming, still wing hammering, and held the boundary like they understood what it was. Then the barn door opened. He came out slowly. There was no urgency in the way he moved, no drama. Just an old man stepping out of his own barn on an afternoon that called for it, wearing the same faded cap and the same worn denim jacket he always wore, carrying a tin pail in his right hand. He walked toward the flock, the way a man walks toward something he trusts. When he reached the edge of the group, he raised the pail once, shook it gently, and let the cracked corn scatter across the mud in a wide arc. The noise stopped. Not all at once. It rolled down the way it had rolled up, in a wave from the front of the flock to the back, until it was gone and the only sounds left were the soft settling of 90 birds finding their feet again. The light knock of the empty tin pail set down against a fence post, and somewhere far off down the county road, the fading sound of a truck engine that did not belong to anyone who lived there. The 4 men at the fence line had not moved. They were still standing exactly where the sound had found them. Not one of them had spoken since it started. He did not look over at them right away. He looked at the geese first. That was always the way with him. He checked his animals before he checked anything else. Before the barn door, before the fuel tank, before the men standing 30 yards away at the fence line, who had just watched the whole thing happen. He moved among the flock slowly, the way you move through something alive, pausing to let a bird resettle beside his boot, bending once to right a goose that had tangled itself against the low fence wire in the commotion. When he was satisfied the flock was calm and whole, he straightened up, set his hands in his jacket pockets, and finally turned toward the fence. The man who crossed first was the neighbor to the east. He had been the loudest one. Not mean-spirited, not cruel, just loud the way a man gets when he is certain of something and does not mind the world knowing it. He had laughed the morning they arrived. He had shaken his head at the feed store. He had said more than once, within earshot, that the old man had finally gone soft in the years since his wife passed. He crossed the fence without a word about any of that. He came across the muddy ground and stopped a few feet short and looked at the flock settled around the old man's boots in the amber afternoon light. Then he put out his hand. The veteran took it. No speech was made, no apology delivered, no account was given of how wrong a man can be and how quiet the evidence can sit waiting to prove it. The handshake was the whole thing. When it was done, the neighbors stepped back, and the two of them stood there for a moment, looking at the same barnyard. The red barn with its peeling paint. The fuel tank gleaming untouched in the late sun. The 90 geese moving slowly through the mud like something ancient and unconcerned. I have thought about that afternoon more times than I can count. What I keep coming back to is this. He never needed them to understand while it was happening. He did not explain himself at the auction, did not argue at the fence line, did not try to change a single mind during all those months they laughed. He just kept the corn filled and the gate clear and let the animals do what animals do when somebody bothers to see what they are worth. Some men carry a rule that was taught to them a long time ago in hard places far from here, that you do not walk away from the helpless just because it costs you something, that you look at a broken thing and ask what it still has left to give. That valley stopped laughing at that farm the afternoon those geese went off. It never started again.